Kane here with you for HIT 421 Legal Affairs or Legal Aspects and Release of Information and HIPAA and all that good stuff. I'm going to apologize in advance. I've been doing quite a few lecture videos today and my voice is starting to give out, so I may cough a little bit, and I apologize. I'll try and get a cough drop here to prevent it. We are still on week 8. This is the second lecture video for week 8. It is on chapter 13. Chapter 12 was HIPAA security rule. Now we've moved on to chapter 13, which talks about those security threats and controls. If you are following along in your book, make sure that you are on page 285. Okay, so overview. Healthcare organizations must address circumstances that threaten privacy and security of patient information. The HIPAA security rule requires implementation of security safeguards to protect ePHI. It says NIST and other standards are also covered in the chapter. I am looking here as to what they are calling NIST. And it looks like it is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. Top of page 286. That's a bit of a new abbreviation for me, so I'm wondering if it's the same for you. Types of security threats that organizations may experience. These include human, natural, and environmental. Excuse me. Both human and natural and environmental threats can also be categorized as internal threats, meaning within the organization, or external threats, meaning outside of the organization. That makes sense, doesn't it? Human threats, those can be intentional. You can have people that are unhappy. You can have people that are hackers or pranksters. You can have people who choose to do very bad things such as theft, intentional alteration and destruction, or are involved with viruses. And we're not talking about COVID here. It can be unintentional. An employee can make an error. They can unintentionally cause an alteration or destruction. Internal breaches caused by humans are more common than external breaches. Please make sure that you are aware of that. That is unfortunately true. But on the positive side, most internal breaches are unintentional. And that's why training is so important. Training and reminders, updates, making sure that you have all sorts of things in place to catch these as they happen, so that you can do some education and prevention. Again, they're generally unintentional. Some examples of external threats would be like our derecho storm that we had here in Iowa, because we don't get hurricanes. Tornadoes, absolutely. Lightning could possibly be it. High winds. Sometimes we can get winds 40, 50, 60 miles an hour going through Iowa. We've got that prairie, that flattish prairie land, and we can get some high winds. So those are all types of external threats that are natural or physical. Internal threats would be like fire, water damage. You know, have you ever seen a pipe break open and leak? Water and electronics do not play well together. And in cases of fire, again, not a good situation when you're talking about electronics. So it highlights the need for disaster recovery, business continuity planning to minimize downtime and restore data. We are so dependent on electronic PHI these days. So there have to be measures in place of what if we have this? What if we have that? What if it's smoke damage, not fire or water? What if it's loss of power for an extended period of time? What if it's loss of internet? What if it's damage to equipment itself? What if we get a big power surge and it fries some of the internal components of equipment. All of those types of things have to be considered. Vulnerabilities are weaknesses that can impact security or something that can be exploited. A threat vector is the path taken to exploit the vulnerability. And, a lot of times we think about hackers, we think about people with malware and phishing and all sorts of other problems. We'll probably be talking about things like Trojan horses. We'll talk about where there's cyber attacks and all sorts of stuff. Identity theft is a security threat. Identity theft was made possible when electronic information really took off with the fact that it can be stolen. It is a federal crime to commit identity theft, thankfully. And the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, has oversight of identity theft regulations. So that's outside of HIPAA and HHS and all of that. When you're talking about medical identity theft, there are two main types. It is using information or PHI without the knowledge or consent of the victim. It may be to obtain medical services, or it may be to obtain money by falsifying claims. There are other ways too. I'm going to give you an example. There is a healthcare organization in North Carolina. I did not work for it, but it was in a nearby city, and it was a situation where they had set up an online payment situation where people could go in and buy medical equipment or other items, even some things from their gift shop. They could buy all of that online and put in their information, their personal and financial information to purchase these things. And no one was going back and checking, and somehow someone had hacked in and diverted it so that they were able to get these names and financial information of individuals who ordered this stuff online. And it went on for, I don't know, I want to say 3 to 4 years before anyone caught it, where this was happening. So that's another type of medical identity theft. But in this case, the one that they give us here is where the victim gives permission to another to use their insurance card to obtain medical services. I saw that in North Carolina too. Where we usually caught it was with women who came in to give birth. And they would come in and they would use someone else's insurance card and identification to check in. They would give birth, and then when we came around to gather the information needed for the birth certificate, they would then admit that wasn't who they were, because they wanted their real name on their child's birth certificate, not the name of the ID and insurance card that they used to obtain medical services. In many cases, these individuals did not understand that they were committing medical identity theft. In most cases, they thought this was normal practice. Many of these individuals were here, whatever terminology you want to use, they were not American citizens. And so they, in their thought process or their experience or their perceptions, where this was okay. They didn't realize the ramifications. They didn't realize that if they hadn't let us in to understand what was happening, that there could be potential significant life issues come out of this. For instance, if you have someone who is the real person and they're diabetic, then you have someone else who's coming in using their ID, their insurance card to obtain these services, and they're not diabetic, and they end up being given insulin. You can obviously see where this could cause some major significant issues. So, a lot of times it came down to educating these individuals, but there is medical identity theft. It does happen quite a bit. We also had situations where a family member would use another family member's insurance, that maybe they were unemployed, but maybe their brother was not, and they would use that to get services, that type of thing. It can be internal or external. And again, that's whether it's done on the inside or the outside. If a patient's information is altered, but their identity is not abused, it's not medical identity theft. If their financial information is used to purchase goods or services that are not medical in nature, this is not medical identity theft, it is just simply identity theft. Some implications of medical identity theft include financial consequences that impact debt collection, monetary losses, damaged credit, insurance denials. But again, as I mentioned before, it can also cause the possibility of wrong care and an incorrect medical history. That's what we found ourselves doing is with these women who came in and they really weren't who they said they were. We suddenly had to create a new medical record for them, and we had to start pulling apart pieces of information and documentation to identify what belonged to them, what didn't belong to them, to make sure that if they came in the future or the person whose identity they used came into the future, that we were giving them the right care and that we had the correct medical history. How do you detect theft of your own medical identity? Well, you can request an accounting of disclosures. You can look at breach notification requirements. And you probably may have received a notification from a healthcare organization that may have had a breach that they had to notify you about and your identity. Not long ago, I believe I'm not speaking out of turn, but I think Unity Point had an issue, and so they were sending out notices to patients about that. I did not receive one, but I think other people might have. How do you report medical identity theft? Well, there's a whole HIPAA breach notification requirement, and of course, whoever is doing HIPAA privacy or security in your organization would know all of that. And then there's the Fair and Accurate Credit Transactions Act, or FACTA, that requires financial institutions and creditors to develop and implement written identity theft programs to identify, detect, and respond to red flags. This is called the red flag rule. And a red flag is a pattern, practice, or specific activity that could indicate identity theft. And so you have to have things in place that are constantly looking for this. And again, it's all part of your auditing and your electronic health system to bring these forward. In fact, I mentioned, I mentioned that organization that had the issue with purchasing of items. It was through this rule and through some of their audits that they set up that they found that this had been going on. And so it talks about the red flags rule. There are 5 categories of red flags that trigger an alert of possible identity theft, and this lists what they are. And at the bottom it says red flags, but that should be red flags, should be incorporated into healthcare provider policies and procedures. The information about red flags is on page 291 in your book. There are prevention challenges when it comes to medical identity and medical identity theft. You want to make sure that you have preventative safeguards in place. One of the things that the organization that I worked for in North Carolina did was they put into place biometrics, where your right hand was used and they did a scan of the veins in your palm, and that is unique to the individual. And so that was one way that they were able to verify identity to prevent medical identity theft or identity theft. Balancing patient privacy protections with disclosure of identity theft events when that happens, and identifying resources to assist healthcare organizations, providers, and patients that are victims of theft. You need to make sure that you're running appropriate background checks of employees and business associates that may have access to this information. Minimizing the use of Social security numbers for identification, making sure that you redact or replace some of the digits in the number, and avoid displaying the entire number on any document screen or data collection field. Storing patient information in a secure manner, ensuring that physical safeguards such as restricted access and locks are in place. So doing all those types of things. Making sure that you offer lock boxes or other locked storage for personal items so that purses are tucked away, wallets are tucked away in locked ways that people can't come in and take those. So then you have policies and procedures, and this just goes through there. Make sure there's staff training, and then have a proactive response plan or outlines what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. How do you prevent external medical identity theft? This is when a patient presents for service or seeks to obtain benefits such as medical equipment that require you can require a driver's license to verify identity. You can take a photograph of the patient. Again, when talked about biometric identifiers, palm scans was what the organization I worked for chose to do. And I think it was very effective and very non-offensive. You can always compare patient signatures from previous encounters, and that's a lot of what we did in HIM with records release. If we didn't have a person in front of us to give us a driver's license or those types of things, we compared patient signatures. And then making sure that you have valid baseline information. Doing background checks of employees and business associates, minimizing temp hiring, because you want to make sure you know who you have in your facility and that you've vetted them appropriately and that they are not a risk for theft or identity theft. Make sure you're, again, protecting those social security numbers and have very tight or stringent access controls and system controls. You make sure in terms of your mitigation activities that you're addressing breach notification requirements. You have to know the laws and the statutes and make sure you follow those. You need to make sure you separate the intermingled health information of the victim and the perpetrator, and sometimes as it's appropriate to contact law enforcement. And then in terms of security access and system controls, you want to make sure that you have things in place that prevent unauthorized individuals from retrieving, using, or altering information, and that only individuals with a need to know should have access to EPHI, a job-related need to know. So you're looking at who has a right to access the information and how do they access that information. So you're looking at user-based, role-based, and context-based. And these are examples here. And let's see. This is all on page 295 in your book. Okay, entity authentication is on page 296, and this is determining an entity is the one claimed based on predetermined criteria, looking at user ID, authentication methods such as passwords or biometric identifiers, tokens, swipe cards. A lot of places that I've worked at have badges that have microchips in them, where you swipe those or where they identify you specifically in some way. You can use telephone callback for remote access. That sometimes works. There are two types of authentication. One is single factor and another is two-factor, and this just defines what those are. And all of this information is on pages 296, 297, 298, 299. So you can read through that and understand what they're communicating. This talks about passwords and what you want to do in terms of passwords. At the bottom of page 298 in your book, there's figure 13.3. That has guidelines for choosing passwords, some do's and don'ts, which is really good to know. And that's here on the screen as well, but it's in your book. You want to make sure that there's automatic log-offs, that when someone is ending their employment, that their access is terminated, or if they switch roles, that their old access is turned off and their new access is turned on appropriately. Have audit trails running and reviewed. It's not enough to have audit trails set if no one reviews them. They have to be reviewed. Sometimes tokens or biometric identification are used. There needs to be employee non-disclosure agreements and training at least on an annual basis. And then there needs to be regular review and modification of individual access. And again, security training. As new technologies and policy changes occur, people need to be trained. Remote access control, this just talks through when organizations have people working from home or accessing EPHI while at home or traveling, and some of the issues and challenges with that, and ways that you can be protective of the information and the individual and their equipment. So this goes through all of that, bottom of page 300 into page 301. Remote network access, again, is these are the recommendations. SANS doesn't define what SANS is here, but I'm sure that we can look that up if you have a question on that. Let's see, that may be a line further back. Okay, so there's all these ways to make sure that you have policies in place, agreements in place, configuration standards. Need to make sure about mobile devices, and that these can include smartphones, iPads, laptops. They can even include smart watches, things like that. And then you need to make sure you've got your system controls in place. And so system controls can be like transmission of EPHI via fax or email. Cybersecurity, your book starts to talk on this, about this on the bottom of page 301, moving into 302. This is a really hot topic, and it will continue to be because of cyber attacks. Cyber security is going to be something that organizations are going to have to be aggressive about and sometimes struggle with, but need to anticipate. It says here at the bottom, one of the major causes of data breaches is not having the cybersecurity that you need. And then looking at systems controls, workstation use and securities, having screensavers, screen shields, screen positioning, policies and procedures, making sure data encryption is what it needs to be. And talks through data encryption on pages 302 and 303 in your book, so please be sure to read through that. Firewall protection is also covered. If you're ever using a system for either an organization or something like that, and you're limited in what you can access on the internet, and you get frustrated, remember, it's because they're trying to protect the organization. There's so much out on the internet, and you can stumble into things that are very bad very quickly without knowing it. So firewalls are built to be restrictive, and that's a good thing. This just explains about routers. And this is at the top of page 304 in your book. Some other system controls include intrusion detection systems, intrusion prevention systems, antivirus programs. And then this talks about different types of viruses. You may have heard of file infectors, system or boot record infectors, macroviruses, worms, Trojan horses. So there's all those types of things. An antivirus program is absolutely worth its weight in gold. There are so many viruses out there. Need to make sure when it comes to transmission of EPHI, that there are policies and procedures to safeguard the data, whether you fax it, use the internet, email. Telehealth and telemedicine are huge these days. With COVID, they have just expanded phenomenally. I mean, just exponentially expanded in their use, and they will continue to do so. And how do you safeguard that transmission? Wireless communication devices and social media. When it comes to faxing health records, AHIMA has some guidelines that they like to recommend, and they are listed for you here. And also, I think, are they included in your book, maybe? Not seeing it, but that's not to say it wasn't there. Just make sure you read through your book very carefully. There's a lot of information in this chapter. The internet, we continue to rely more and more on the internet and need to have ways that we use it defined, as well as how we protect data in our systems. Email. Email is so heavily used. Really encouraged not to use it for highly sensitive information because it can become part of the discovery process. If you're going to send something sensitive through email, make sure you put on there confidential and privileged, and that you send it to someone who by virtue of being an attorney or by their role, is confidential and privileged. So just a lot to think about with email. Medical device security. This is an area that people have overlooked. Medical devices can be hacked into. You think about pacemakers. That's an example of a medical device where you want to make sure you have security, that somebody can't just hack into your pacemaker and make changes to it, or gather the information about you as an individual that may be linked to it. There are other medical devices. These days there are smart IV pumps and other types of things that have PHI in them. And you certainly don't want someone hacking into your organization and pulling that away from your patients that might be in ICU or someplace like that. Telehealth, telemedicine, talk briefly about that. Thinking ahead to next year, one of the things that you'll do is put together a program for what's called the Showcase. A great topic to think about would be the security of telehealth or telemedicine. And then this just talks about issues that include privacy, social media. We've seen social media come out of nowhere in the last 10 years and suddenly become this major player in healthcare, not to mention in people's personal lives. And how does that present risks to privacy and security of PHI? There's all sorts of things. Healthcare organizations a lot of times will have policies and procedures regarding what constitutes appropriate and inappropriate posting. They may tell you that in your role in the organization, you cannot be involved in social media. And anyone who is in any way a patient or volunteer or employee or what have you within the organization. obviously to protect you as well as the organization itself. Then contingency and disaster planning. We already really talked a lot about this, but there's still more about it in your book at the bottom of page 309 into page 310. I'll leave you to read that. Good information there. Data backup, obviously things need to be backed up and kept, and how do you do that, and how do you make sure it's secure and kept for the right period of time. Have to have processes for that, policies, procedures. And then data recovery. Sometimes if you can't restore something, you're going to have, if you can't recover it, you need to restore it. I guess you could go the other way too, but you've got to make sure that you can bring it back. Emergency mode of operations. What happens when everything goes down? How do you keep documenting? What do you do during those downtimes? Do you revert back to paper, or do you have a backup system that you can put it into where it can be copied and moved forward into your live system when it comes back up? There's all those types of things to be considered. And this is on page 311 in your book. And it even gives you some sample disaster plan development checklists and contingency plans. There are resources to assist you if you're wondering about threats. And that is it for chapter 13. Have a great rest of your week.